The Ascot Drive area in Derby evolved on land which once belonged to a rich and eminent family. For some reason which I've never understood, many of the major roads and streets within this new development were named after famous racecourses. At its southern end, Ascot Drive connects to Osmaston Road. Here's a picture taken in 1922, and you can see that some people were already lucky enough to possess motor vehicles. To this day, it is a very busy road with a minor history of ghost sightings, which might be explained by the extent of the traffic and the inevitable number of road accidents. After World War II, the Derby City Council acquired all the land of the old estate and just about eradicated every trace of it. Yet there are still small pockets of paranormal activity that continue to this day. Osmaston Hall was originally built in 1696, and for almost 200 years it was the home of the wealthy and well-connected Wilmot family. The hall was surrounded by 250 acres. There were farm buildings, stables, and one of the acres was devoted to the family chapel and graveyard. The Church of St. James the Lesser was used by the local people for all their religious needs, and many of them were actually interred in the churchyard. By 1938, Osmaston Hall had belonged for almost half a century to the London and Midlands Scottish Railway Company. At that point, they had no further use for the hall or most of its outbuildings, and everything apart from the church was demolished. By the 1970s, the chapel was gone, and the once fine red brick vicarage was just a boarded up shell. The graveyard itself was just a mess of destroyed headstones and cracked open cribs. Some of the local people even tried to get into exposed coffins and rob the dead. The nearby long wooden footbridge which connected Longbridge Lane to Osmaston Road was said to be haunted by a vampire, a foul creature which smelt of decay, the sickly sweet odour of rotting vegetables, or something that has been dead and left unburied for too long. Just after the end of World War II, the Derby City Council purchased all the land that formerly belonged to the Wilmot estate. By the late 1970s, having removed all the burials from the graveyard on Longbridge Lane, the council attempted to repurpose that plot of land by turning it into a residential site for gypsies, Romanies and travelling folk. However, the gypsies knew that this used to be a cemetery and totally refused to live there. Thus, the city council had to turn the land to a more mundane use. Derby once had its own canal. It ran on the edge of what is now the Ascot Drive industrial estate. The canal is long gone, and most of its bridges and all of its locks have been eradicated. The canal was converted into a footpath, and in my youth many people shared stories of strange experiences at night when walking the route between St Osmond's Church and the point known as Parson's Bridge. They reported being followed or shadowed by a dark figure, which moved like a living person and yet did not seem to be flesh and blood. Frequently described as a wandering ghost or even a vampire, it was often suggested that this figure came from St Osmond's churchyard. However, it should be noted that St Osmond's Church has never had a graveyard. My own experiences lead me to believe that Parson's Bridge, rather than the church, is the originating factor in this phenomena. I suspect that there was a sudden death at Parson's Bridge, whether by accident, foul play or suicide, and that this has led to a restless spirit trying to make his presence felt. Parson's Bridge was demolished many decades ago and now exists only as a name. As a teenager, I passed this spot many times at night and I never saw anything. But in those days, the walkway was composed of many very thick and heavy concrete slabs. Frequently when I passed Parson's Bridge in the dark of night, one of those big slabs would move and pivot with a loud, clonking sound, as if somebody had stepped upon it. She was a ghost, though I did not realize it at the time. As a teenager, I got my first real job at Youngman Forklift Hire. Dot worked there too as a cleaning lady. She was certainly middle-aged, but she looked much older than her years. She was married to a drunken, violent man who apparently hit her. She had a troubled life, and it showed in every line and wrinkle on her face. One thing that stood out about Dot was the colour of her hair. She dyed it red, not a subtle shade of Titian or Auburn or ginger, but literally red, like the colour of a fire truck. Problems at home forced Dot to quit her job, and we rather missed her. I didn't see Dot for many months, and then one bitterly cold November night, I was taking my dog for a walk quite close to where I worked, and I saw her again. My dog was very protective, and when he noticed somebody walking down the long, deserted street at that time of night, he paused and waited, looking. I looked too, and at first I couldn't recognize who the person was, until she got a little bit closer and her bright red hair stood out. It was Dot. So I paused and I waited for her. It was a horribly cold night, and I remember that I could feel the gusts of wind knifing through the thick coat and the layers of garments that I was wearing. So when Dot came closer, I was surprised to see that she was wearing just a thin summer dress with a cardigan. Her arms were folded across her chest. Her coin purse was tucked under the crook of her elbow. Her eyes were wide open, and I mean wide open, as if she'd been scared or startled to the extreme. I waited patiently until she came closer. And then when she had almost passed me by, I said, "Good evening, Dot." There wasn't a flicker of response from her. Not a whisper, not a sound, not a glance. She kept walking. I thought that maybe she was intoxicated. Maybe she'd been drinking away her sorrows. And I stood there and I watched, and she seemed to be heading towards the junction between Ascot Drive and Osmaston Road. She lived on the other side of Osmaston Road, and she seemed to be knowing where she was going. So I watched and I waited until Dot disappeared out of sight, finally becoming a small, tiny figure and vanishing in the night. Well, I went to work after the weekend and I saw Jerry Smith, the yard foreman. Jerry was a great friend of Dot. And I said to him, "Hey, Jerry, I saw Dot on Friday night." And he said very quickly, very directly, very bluntly, "No, you didn't." He spoke so quickly and so emphatically that I thought he was going to make a joke. But he wasn't feeling amused. In fact, he was angry. He thought I had just made some kind of a smart-ass, cruel joke of my own. I asked him to explain, and finally he told me that I could not have seen Dot on Friday night because she'd died 3 months earlier. I asked him to explain further. He asked me, "Do you remember that wonderful summer-like day we had at the beginning of September?" I did remember it, for I'd taken my then-girlfriend to Markeaton Park and had a wonderful day with her. He said, well, Dot lived next door to the corner shop, and on that day she stepped into the store to buy a few things, wearing just a cardigan she'd slipped on, carrying a purse under her arm as usual, and she was in line waiting to pay for her groceries when she had a brain embolism and died instantly on the spot.